I am 95 years old. I have lived almost a full century on this earth, and I have been afraid for every single day of it. Afraid of failure, afraid of rejection, afraid of pain, afraid of embarrassment, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of making any choice at all. My name is Dorothy. I am sitting in a chair in a room I never wanted to live in a town I never wanted to stay in, surrounded by a life I never wanted to live but was too afraid to change. I am the woman who said no to everything because yes felt too dangerous. Before I die, before fear finally wins its long battle against my courage, I need to tell you what happens when you let fear make all your decisions. What it costs to choose safety over living, certainty over possibility, the known over the unknown. You think fear is protecting you. You think it is keeping you safe from harm, from disappointment, from the pain that comes with taking risks and failing. You think being afraid is the same as being smart, that caution is the same as wisdom. You are wrong. Let me tell you about the first time fear won. I was 18 years old in 1947, fresh out of high school, when I got a letter. A letter from a college in California offering me a scholarship to study literature. A full scholarship to a school 3,000 miles away from the small Ohio town where I had lived my entire life. I had dreamed of being a writer since I was 12 years old. I wrote stories in notebooks I hid under my bed, poems I never showed anyone, essays about the world I imagined existed beyond the boundaries of our little town. That scholarship was my chance to study with real writers, to meet people who shared my dreams, to see if I had the talent to make a living from words. But California was far away. I had never been more than 50 miles from home. I did not know anyone there. What if I was not smart enough? What if I could not make friends? What if I got sick and my family was too far away to help? What if I failed and had to come home in shame? The fear whispered all these possibilities in my ear until they felt more real than the dream itself. So I said no to the scholarship. I stayed home, got a job at the local bank, and told myself I was being practical, responsible, smart. I told myself I could write in my spare time, that I did not need college to be a writer. But the truth was, I was too afraid to find out if I was good enough. Too afraid to risk discovering that my dreams were bigger than my talent. I never wrote another story after I turned down that scholarship. Every time I sat down with a pen and paper, I heard the voice that had talked me out of California telling me I was not good enough, that I was fooling myself, that real writers did not come from small towns in Ohio. Fear had not protected me from failure. It had guaranteed it. The second time fear won was in 1951. I met a man named James at a church social. James was different from the local boys I had grown up with. He had been to Europe during the war, had seen things, and been places that seemed magical to me. He was smart and funny, and he made me feel like I could be someone more interesting than the small-town bank teller I had become. James asked me to marry him after we had been dating for 6 months, but he also told me he wanted to travel, to see the world, to live in different places and have adventures. He had job offers in New York and Chicago and Seattle. He wanted us to pick a city and start over together, to build something new, somewhere exciting. I wanted to say yes. Every part of me except the afraid part wanted to pack my bags and follow this man to whatever adventure he was offering. But the fear was louder than the want. What if we moved to a big city and I could not make friends? What if James changed his mind about me once he saw me away from everything familiar? What if we could not find good jobs? What if we ran out of money? What if I got homesick? So I told James I could not leave my family, could not abandon my job, could not start over somewhere new. I asked him to stay in Ohio with me, to build a safe, predictable life in the town where we both knew what to expect. James tried to compromise for 2 years. He took a job he hated at the local hardware store, rented a small apartment near my family, tried to build the life I thought I wanted. But I could see him shrinking, becoming smaller and sadder every day. The man who had traveled the world was dying in a town where nothing ever changed. In 1953, James left. He took a job in Chicago and asked me one last time to come with him. I said no. I was too afraid to leave the safety of everything I knew, too afraid to trust that love was worth the risk of an uncertain future. James married someone else 2 years later, someone who was brave enough to build a life with him, to take chances, to choose love over fear. I stayed in Ohio and told myself I had made the right choice, the safe choice, the smart choice. But I had not made the smart choice. I had made the afraid choice. And I spent the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had been brave enough to say yes to love instead of no to uncertainty. The third time fear won was in 1965. My father died and left me the house I had grown up in. It was too big for one person, expensive to maintain, full of memories that felt more like ghosts than comfort. I could have sold it, taken the money, and finally seen some of the world I had dreamed about, but never dared to explore. I could have moved to a city, taken classes, learned new skills, met new people. At 36, I was still young enough to start over, to become someone different than the woman who had spent 18 years saying no to every opportunity that came her way. But selling the house felt too risky. What if property values went up and I regretted selling? What if I moved somewhere new and could not make friends? What if I ran out of money? What if I got sick and needed help? What if being alone in a new place was worse than being alone in a familiar place? So I kept the house. I kept the job. I kept the life that felt like a prison. But at least it was a prison I understood. I chose the misery I knew over the happiness I might find if I was willing to risk looking for it. The fourth time fear won was in 1972. My boss at the bank was retiring, and he recommended me for his position. It would have meant a significant raise, new responsibilities, the chance to finally use the intelligence I had been hiding behind a typewriter for 25 years. But it also meant change. It meant people depending on me to make important decisions. It meant the possibility of making mistakes that other people would see. It meant stepping out of the background, where I had been comfortable being invisible. What if I was not good enough for the promotion? What if I made mistakes that got people fired? What if the other employees resented me for advancing? What if I failed publicly instead of privately? I told my boss I was not interested in the promotion. I said I was happy with my current position, that I did not want the stress of additional responsibility. He was disappointed, but he found someone else to take the job. I stayed at the same desk, doing the same work for another 15 years, watching younger women with less experience get promoted around me because they were willing to risk failure in ways I was not. Fear had convinced me that saying no was protecting me from embarrassment, but really, it was protecting me from success. Every opportunity I turned down became proof that I was not the kind of person who deserved opportunities, which made the next opportunity feel even more impossible to accept. The fifth time fear won was in 1978. My mother had a stroke and needed someone to take care of her. I was the obvious choice since I was single, lived in the family house, and had no other commitments tying me down. Caring for my mother became my full-time life outside of work. I cooked her meals, helped her with physical therapy, drove her to doctor appointments, and spent my evenings reading to her or watching television shows she enjoyed. During the 6 years I cared for my mother, several men asked me out. Nice men who understood my situation and were willing to work around my caregiving responsibilities. Men who might have brought companionship and even love into my life if I had been willing to make room for them. But dating felt too complicated. What if a relationship interfered with my mother's care? What if I had to choose between my mother's needs and my own happiness? What if I fell in love, and then my mother's condition worsened, and I had to break up with someone who had come to depend on my attention? So I said no to every invitation, every possibility of connection. I told myself I was being a good daughter, that my mother's needs came first, that there would be time for my own life later when my obligations were finished. But really, I was using my mother's illness as an excuse to avoid the risk that comes with letting someone matter to you. I was hiding behind duty to avoid the possibility of being hurt, rejected, or abandoned. When my mother died in 1984, I was 55 years old and completely alone. I had spent 6 years using her care as a reason to avoid building relationships, and when she was gone, I had no one. The isolation I had chosen felt like grief, but really it was the natural consequence of choosing fear over connection year after year. The 6th time fear won was in 1987. I inherited some money when my uncle died. Not enough to retire, but enough to finally do some of the things I had dreamed about for 40 years. I could have traveled to Europe, taken art classes, learned a language, moved to a different city, gone back to school. I could have used that money to finally start living instead of just existing. But what if I spent the money on experiences and then needed it for emergencies? What if I traveled alone and something bad happened to me? What if I took classes and was not good at them? What if I moved and was even more lonely in a new place? So I put the money in certificates of deposit and savings accounts where it would be safe. I bought the highest yield, lowest risk investments I could find and told myself I was being responsible with my inheritance. But I was not being responsible. I was being afraid. I was choosing the guaranteed small return over the possibility of a large return on investment in my own happiness. The money grew slowly and safely for 30 years. When I finally had to move to assisted living at 85, the inheritance had doubled. I had enough money to pay for my care, which made me feel proud of my conservative financial planning. But I realized too late that the money had cost me more than it gained me. I had spent 30 years protecting an inheritance instead of using it to buy experiences I could never get back. I had chosen financial security over life security, safe money over a rich life. Fear had convinced me that holding on to money was smart, but really it had convinced me to hold on to the wrong thing. I had saved for a future that turned out to be too short to enjoy the savings. The 7th time fear won was in 1995. I was 66 and eligible for early retirement from the bank. I had worked there for 48 years, and I was tired. Tired of the same routine, the same people, the same small problems that felt enormous, because they were the only problems I had allowed myself to have. I could have retired, taken my pension, and finally done some of the living I had been postponing for decades. I could have traveled, volunteered, taken up hobbies, maybe even tried writing again after 40 years of telling myself I was not good enough. But retiring felt too risky. What if I got bored? What if I spent too much money and ran out of savings? What if I got sick and could not afford good medical care? What if being unemployed made me feel worthless? What if I discovered that without work to define me, there was nothing interesting about me at all? So I kept working for another 15 years, until I was 81, and my arthritis made it impossible to sit at a desk for 8 hours a day. I worked until my body forced me to stop, instead of stopping when I still had the health and energy to enjoy retirement. By the time I finally retired, I was too old and too tired to do most of the things I had imagined doing with my freedom. I had waited until it was safe to retire. which meant waiting until it was too late to enjoy it. Fear had convinced me that working longer was protecting my financial future, but really it was stealing my personal future. I had traded the best years of my retirement for the false security of a larger pension that I was too old to spend on anything meaningful. Every major decision of my life was made by fear instead of by me. Fear chose my career, my relationships, my living situation, my activities, my retirement. Fear was the real author of my life story, and it wrote a very boring, very safe, very small story about a woman who was too afraid to live. I am 95 years old now, and I can see the end of my story approaching. I am dying in the same town where I was born, in a nursing home where I know no one, surrounded by a life that feels like it belonged to someone else because I never had the courage to claim it as my own. The other residents here tell stories about their adventures, their travels, their careers, their families. They talk about risks they took and chances they seized and mistakes they made while pursuing something they wanted badly enough to fight for. I have no stories like that. I have no adventures to remember, no big risks that paid off or failed spectacularly. I have no grand love affairs, no career triumphs, no exotic travels, no passionate pursuits. My life has been the absence of life, the accumulation of things I did not do, places I did not go, chances I did not take. The saddest part is that most of the things I was afraid of never happened anyway. I was afraid of financial ruin, but I always had enough money. I was afraid of public failure, but I never tried anything big enough to fail at publicly. I was afraid of heartbreak, but my heart broke anyway from loneliness and regret. I was afraid of taking risks that might result in rejection, embarrassment, or disappointment. But the safe choices I made instead resulted in a different kind of rejection, embarrassment, and disappointment. I rejected myself. I was embarrassed by my own cowardice. And I was disappointed by a life that never lived up to its potential. Fear promised to protect me from suffering, but really, it guaranteed a different kind of suffering. Instead of the sharp pain of failure or rejection, I got the dull ache of perpetual regret. Instead of the temporary disappointment of things not working out, I got the permanent disappointment of never finding out what would have happened if I had tried. The irony is that the worst-case scenarios I was always preparing for were not as bad as the reality I created by avoiding them. Getting fired from a job I hated would not have been worse than spending 50 years at a job that bored me. Being rejected by someone I loved would not have been worse than spending 70 years alone. Failing at something I was passionate about would not have been worse than succeeding at nothing I cared about. Fear made me overestimate the risks of action and underestimate the risks of inaction. It convinced me that staying still was safer than moving forward, that the known was always better than the unknown, that small disasters were more dangerous than large regrets. But inaction has its own consequences. Standing still has its own risks. The known, when it is small and sad and empty, is much worse than the unknown when it holds even the possibility of something better. If I could do it over again, I would choose the unknown every single time. I would say yes to California, yes to James, yes to selling the house, yes to the promotion, yes to dating, yes to spending the inheritance, yes to early retirement. I would choose risk over safety, uncertainty over boredom, the possibility of failure over the guarantee of regret. Because failure is temporary, but regret is permanent. Embarrassment fades, but the embarrassment of never trying lasts forever. Hearts heal from love that does not work out, but they never heal from love you are too afraid to pursue. Young people who are reading this, who are facing choices between safety and possibility, between the known and the unknown, between what is comfortable and what might be wonderful. Please learn from my mistakes. Do not let fear make your decisions for you. Do not confuse being afraid with being smart. Do not mistake caution for wisdom or safety for success. The voice in your head that tells you all the things that could go wrong if you take a chance is not protecting you. It is imprisoning you. It is trading your potential for the illusion of security. Most of the things you are afraid of will never happen. And if they do happen, you are stronger and more resilient than you think. You can survive failure, rejection, embarrassment, disappointment. You can recover from mistakes, learn from setbacks, bounce back from defeats. But you cannot recover time you do not take, chances you do not seize, risks you do not accept. You cannot get back the years you spend waiting for perfect conditions that never come. Perfect is not an option. Safe is not sustainable. Fear is not your friend, and it is definitely not your advisor. Take the scholarship. Marry the person who wants to see the world with you. Move to the new city. Apply for the promotion. Go on the date. Spend some of the inheritance. Retire while you can still enjoy it. Choose uncertainty over misery. Choose possibility over safety. Choose living over existing. Because I am 95 years old, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that a life lived in fear is not a life at all. It is just a very long, very careful way of dying. I am tired now. Tired of being afraid, and tired of the life that fear created for me. But mostly I am tired of wasting the precious time I have left, wishing I had been brave enough to waste it differently. Be brave. Be reckless. Be willing to fail spectacularly rather than succeed at being small. Your life is waiting for you to be courageous enough to claim it.